So I started recording this video a few days ago. Since then, all hell has broken loose, but it does mean that what you're getting now is bang up to date. The critical thing is that while Theresa May's fortunes have changed dramatically, the general structure even of all of these relationships has not changed massively. We still have a people, we still have elections. And the difference between the British and the American system hasn't changed much either. In fact, it's just become all the more stark. In America, you have an election and you have a direct mandate, and that gives you a president. As you know by now, over here on our side of the pond, it's a bit more complicated. Out of the election, we have a parliament arise. There's going to be one party that has a majority in that parliament. The prime minister of that party will be invited to form a government on the basis of parliamentary government. So there's the government. And then within that, there will be this supreme executive authority called cabinet. And that is cabinet government. And that basically is the structure that attends to the executive in the United Kingdom. And we have that peculiar organization of different offices and responsibilities. The Prime Minister, of course, being primus inter pares across them all. So what we're going to look at is how the nature of those relationships change, whether they're stable, whether they're wobbly, because that is critically important. Because what we do know is that when all of these are lined up, the Prime Minister can be massively strong. So the Prime Minister, remember, they dominate cabinet by the use of patronage, agenda, and of course the spatial management. Cabinet then controls government by virtue of the collective responsibility, and Parliament is controlled by government through the use of the compliant majority and the institutional imbalance. And so in reality, what we've got is, rather than a jumble like that, it's really a nice, strong, stable situation like this, bound together by these various things that we have been talking about. And all other things being equal, a Prime Minister can get things done that a President can only dream about. The reality, however, is often slightly different. Remember, we said that all authority was entirely derived, and that can start looking wobbly at any given time. As a result of that, the Prime Minister can only ever be as strong as the constituent parts. And if they're wobbling and if they ultimately collapse, then that's game over, and the Prime Minister's position is utterly untenable. You can't do that with the President. If you've got yourself a President, you can't get rid of him just because he's a bit useless. And if the current evidence doesn't make that abundantly clear, then we're in bigger trouble than we thought. Anyway, it's going to be easier if we can explore that through various different examples. And we're going to start off back in 1974. So in 1974, we have two elections, remember. The first one returned a hung parliament. The second gave Labour a wafer-thin majority. Within 2 years, that minority had been wiped out by resignations and by-elections, and the government was sustained by a fairly clumsy Lib-Lab pact that staggered along until 1979. In 1979, the Conservatives sniffed blood. They thought this is the time to trigger a confidence motion. So this was a confidence motion that was triggered by Parliament. And of course, the Callaghan government lost. They lost by one vote, but they had no choice. That was the end of their government's legitimacy, and so the government collapsed. So there we have Parliament undoing the executive, undoing government. What happened next, of course, was that we had another election. Out of that, we had a party come into power. The party had a majority in the House of Commons. That party was, of course, Margaret Thatcher's Conservatives, so she was invited to form a government. And so she did. And that went along, for better or worse, until 1990, until we started to have some real dissent in the ranks. Again, the key thing here is that this was the party that was starting to move against the Prime Minister. And it was moving against the Prime Minister because the poll tax was massively unpopular. Europe was divisive. Yeah, funny that. And the Prime Minister's style was particularly abrasive, and she was really winding up people the wrong way. Now, what happened next was that there was a leadership challenge. And the way in which the Conservatives ran it back in the 90s was that it was a two-stage process. The first stage was necessary to see if it was a credible challenge. And Mrs. Thatcher won, but she won by an insufficiently large margin to preclude a second election. If it was going to be a sort of comprehensive victory first time round, then she needed to win by 15% clear. And she didn't. And so what we had there was a situation in which the Parliament was saying, you know what, the party, was saying, we're not happy anymore. We're not having this. At that point, Cabinet, which had been wobbling a bit, said, we're really not happy with this either. And so they withdrew their support. And so Thatcher lost 2 layers of the wobbly tower of power, and of course as a consequence she had no choice but tearfully to resign. And so she did. Now, the Parliament hadn't changed at this point, and the Conservative Party still had a majority. So they had an internal election, and of course you will remember that out of that, John Major emerged triumphant, and so it was his turn to form a government, and he did that. And he enjoyed a really tumultuous ride all the way up to 1997, when of course he was displaced by Tony Blair. Now, this is where it gets really, really interesting, because what did Tony Blair do? Tony Blair won elections. That's what he was incredibly good at. And you can look at the size of his majority there, 179. Now, remember that they hadn't been in government since 1979. And as a result of that, all of the kids, and they were kids, they were called Bears, Blairs, Babes, all of the kids who were in there knew that they were there for one reason and one reason only, and that was Tony Blair. He was an election winner. And so while Tony Blair started to play fast and loose with the whole structure of parliamentary government and cabinet government, Parliament went along with the ride because he was a winner. The problem for Blair was that post-Iraq his popularity bubble burst. He continued to ride it out, but while the party was still very happy here, because they were living in the Westminster bubble and they were very, very happy, they liked their seats in Parliament, Cabinet, on the other hand, was looking ahead. And also, we had a real problem in Cabinet, because within Cabinet, we had Gordon Brown. And Gordon Brown was under the impression that he was the leader-elect. He was very much of the idea that Blair was going to go in, win election, maybe 2 elections, consolidate power, and then hand over to Brown, who certainly, according to Brown, was the real brains behind the Blair-Brown operation. Also, we had policy going south, and we had very, very presidential style, and that was really stretching the elastic about as far as it could. And between the style and the policy stretching the elastic and Brown constantly chuntering, it snapped back. And it snapped back quite violently in 2008, and there was an awful lot of dissent within Cabinet. Now, at no point was Cabinet ever going to turn around and tell Blair to clear off, but he realized that the mood was turning against him. And as a result of that, what Blair did was that he jumped before he was pushed. And there he goes. At that point, everything else remained pretty much the same. Gordon Brown came in as he had hoped to do, and he became the heir apparent to Blair, and it all went south from there, certainly for the Labour government. So that brings us pretty much up to date, with May still to come. Before we get on to that, remember that the Prime Minister has only derived authority, and the strength of that authority relies entirely upon the constituent parts. We saw there how Callaghan was undone by Parliament. We saw how the party triggered the process that led to the demise of Margaret Thatcher, and we saw how Cabinet was essentially responsible for the removal of Blair in 2008. Question is, which one of those is going to be responsible for the demise of Theresa May? Well, for a while it looked like it was going to be the party. We know that May lacks the support of the party because they had a vote of no confidence. We also know that Cabinet is not happy with her because Cabinet is full of Brexiteers and Remainers, and both of them think she's doing a dreadful job. As I said earlier, the party has triggered a vote of no confidence, and Parliament, well, that's actually go without saying, because they have admitted that, or they have accused the government of holding them in contempt. And I really will make sure that I link off on the back of that there's a fantastic article in The Guardian about patterns of contempt, which is well worth your time. So we had the no confidence motion yesterday. That is the 12th, Wednesday, the 12th of December, and she won. So the Tory coup fails, says The Guardian. And the important thing here to realise is that while the win was not massively convincing, you'll remember it was about 200 to 113 or whatever it was. So a majority of about 87. It was 117, so a majority of 83, doesn't matter. That was substantially more than had said they were going to vote against her actual policy. So it was not a good night for May in that sense. However, in another sense, these guys are now prohibited from holding another confidence motion for 1 year, so she doesn't have to worry about them anymore. That doesn't mean, however, that she's in the clear. Liam Fox went on the record saying, I'm not sure if you can see that, he wasn't sure whether or not Cabinet would consent to the vote going back, would consent to the package going back to the House of Commons. And at the same time, there's absolutely no guarantee. In fact, there's pretty much a cast iron guarantee that any package that is presented to Parliament will be rejected. So right now, Theresa May still has two massively wobbly elements of her Tower of Power, and it seems very, very likely that she's already admitted she won't contest the next election, but I don't think she'll really have much choice in that matter. That's it, I think. From that, there should be lots and lots of questions coming through. I look forward to answering those. I hope that helps. Let me know if it doesn't. And I look forward to answering your questions as they come up. And if I don't see you before then, Merry Christmas.